Well, session 4, we're going to pick up here where we left off. We're going to continue to assess some of Dr. Arnold Fruchtenbaum's arguments regarding why he feels that Gog and Gog's armies are in fact not the Antichrist and his armies, why these two are different individuals. Now, I don't know if I made it clear enough at the beginning, but I want to state what I am arguing for is that, in fact, Gog and his armies are the Antichrist. Gog is the Antichrist, okay? That the description of the events that take place in Ezekiel 38 and 39 are, in fact, the exact same thing that takes place in Revelation 19. Ultimately, it is speaking about the Armageddon campaign. Now, as I said earlier, all of the prophets speak about the same story. They tell the same story. They are focused in on the same series of events, but they all look at these things from different perspectives. They all, as I said, use different cameras. They use different lenses. They look at these things from different angles. Okay, so Ezekiel 38 and 39 is essentially a very broad, generalized description of the coming of the Antichrist, his invasion and his destruction. It's a very sort of zoomed out portrayal of these events. Revelation 19 in the campaign of the Armageddon campaign is a very specific, zeroed in, zoomed in perspective simply on the final battle. Okay? So again, same events, different perspectives. This is no different, for instance, than the Gospels. You know, when I first became a believer and I used to argue with all these different, anti-Bible folks, and they would try to point out various seeming contradictions between the different gospel accounts. Well, you know, John tells this story and Matthew says this, and if you read it, they're contradictory. Well, as always, when you really examine these things, the contradictions fall away. But on a surface reading, at times, there are seeming contradictions. And that's the way it always is when different people tell different stories, different versions, different accounts. But again, as we know with the Gospels, they're all speaking about the same events. And they just come at it sometimes with a different emphasis, with a different focus. Ezekiel 38 and 39 is simply one more biblical portrayal of the Antichrist, his coming against Israel, and his destruction. It's addressed in Revelation 19 with the campaign of Armageddon. It's mentioned in numerous other places throughout the Bible, in Joel and Zechariah. They're all telling the same story. They're simply coming at it with slightly differing emphasis. So, now let's look at Dr. Fruchtenbaum's second argument. What Dr. Fruchtenbaum says here is that the purpose of the Gog invasion is to take spoil. The purpose of the Armageddon campaign is to destroy all Jews. So what he's saying is that the motives of Gog is spoil, plunder, loot, booty, whereas the Armageddon campaign under the Antichrist, the sole driving factor behind it is to kill Jews. So according to Dr. Fruchtenbaum, all the nations of the earth will desire to simply kill Jews, and that is the only driving factor between the Antichrist, whereas Gog, he's saying the motivations are completely different. And he doesn't explore the option that it could be both, but let's go to the next slide. In response to this argument, I would simply say that it is not true at all. Again, if Dr. Fruchtenbaum had looked at the greater wealth of passages throughout the Bible that do discuss the Antichrist, as opposed to just zeroing in on one particular passage, the campaign of Armageddon in Revelation 19, then he would have seen that in fact the Antichrist does invade the land of Israel for plunder, loot, spoil, and booty, and that in fact his motivations and his goals are identical, and they flow in perfect harmony with what Ezekiel says regarding Gog. So first let's look at the verse in Ezekiel. He says, this is again speaking of Gog. He says, on that day, the Lord speaking directly to Gog, you will make an evil plan. You will say, I will go up against a land of unwalled villages for what? to take plunder and to take booty. So there you have the reference to Gog desiring to invade the land of Israel for the wealth of that particular nation. Now, I don't know how many of you follow the news, but it's interesting to take note of the fact that about 2 weeks ago, just off the coast of Haifa in Israel, they discovered a massive deposit of natural gas. So much so that the nation of Israel, it is said, has enough energy to take care of all of their energy for the next 15 years, that they will be completely independent of foreign fuel sources. Now, wouldn't you like to discover a natural gas deposit on your property and be independent of all fuel sources? So it's certainly interesting. This could be a significant factor in terms of the natural resources that are now in Israel. And Lebanon has already come out and said, well, wait a minute, that's ours. So there's already a dispute arising. We'll see how that plays out in the days to come. Let's look at the next slide. Now here we have a verse that's speaking about the Antichrist. Again, I'm not picking on Dr. Fruchtenbaum. I very much respect him. But I want to highlight, if he had looked beyond simply Revelation 19, then he would have seen here a passage that everyone is in agreement on, is speaking about the Antichrist. Zechariah 14, verse 1 and 2. Behold, the day of the Lord cometh, speaking to Israel, thy spoil shall be divided in the midst of thee, for I will gather all the nations against Jerusalem to battle. This is speaking of the invasion of the Antichrist. And what happens? The invading armies come and they divide Israel's spoil in the midst of Israel. Her spoil is divided. Isaiah 10, verses 5 through 7. Again, speaking of the Antichrist, it says, woe to the Assyrian, that's the Antichrist, the rod of my anger, in whose hand is the club of my wrath. I dispatch him against a people who anger me. Why? To seize, loot, and snatch, plunder, and trample them down like mud in the streets. There is nothing to say that the Antichrist cannot come for loot, plunder, and spoil, but also come to destroy Jews. And here, in 2 passages already, we've seen that the Antichrist comes precisely for that, exactly in the same way that Gog comes against Israel. Next slide. In this, and this is essential, this is the bunny trail. This is something that we need to understand. In these passages, we see a glimpse. We get a glimpse into the Antichrist's economics. Okay? The Antichrist's economics. Here is another passage that speaks about the Antichrist. Daniel 11, verse 24. When the richest provinces feel secure, he will invade them. He will distribute plunder, loot, and wealth among his followers. Who does this remind you of? Sort of Robin Hood. He takes from the rich and he gives to the poor. It specifically says that when the richest regions, when the richest nations feel secure, he invades them. And what does he do? He distributes plunder, loot, and wealth among his followers. Is there anybody else that it reminds you of? Let's look at the next slide. Stir up some controversy here. Not to stir up bitter memories, but we all remember the episode with Joe the plumber and Barack Obama, and what did he say? I just want to spread the wealth around. I don't want to take your money. I just want to spread the wealth around. I want to take from the rich and give to those that are more needy. It's important that we take note here, folks. We just saw, in the United States, we saw a phenomenon occur. We saw a virtual religious movement take place that was driven with a populist socialist movement, a movement that was all about playing on the class envy, which is one of the easiest things to play on. Get the rich, pay, make those rich pay. The funny thing is, even the rich don't like the rich. You know, it's such human nature. It's so easy to play on class envy. If you play on, racial hatred, that's extremely politically incorrect. You play on, whatever, ageism, sizeism, it's all politically incorrect. You play on classism, and that is right there, the spirit of the age. There's very few people that will protest it. And it's very important to take note of the degree to which the nation rallied behind this populist message. Take from the rich, give to the poor. Let's go to the next slide. This approach to economics has been utilized by virtually every totalitarian system over the past 100 years. Karl Marx, his famous quote, "From each according to his ability, to each according to his need." It sounds so wonderful on the surface. The end result is always an oppressive system. It oppresses people. It does not liberate people. Communism, as we saw, always results in the crushing of the human spirit. Whether we're looking at Hugo Chavez today or any of these different, Banana Republic, third world military dictators, they always play on the populist message, and the poor of the earth rally to them. That's why a good percentage of South America today is following to these neo-communist regimes. The poor of the earth rally to a populist economic message. Let's go to the next slide. The early church, very well, in looking at that verse in Daniel, understood the fact that the Antichrist would in fact be a populist. And it's interesting that Irenaeus, one of the early church fathers, an individual whose eschatology I largely agree on. He is one of the more orthodox, earliest bishops in the early church. Speaking of the Antichrist, he made this statement. He said, the Antichrist pretends that he vindicates the poor. And it's interesting to note that he doesn't say he vindicates the poor. It says he pretends to vindicate the poor. And every dictator is the same. They pretend to vindicate the poor. They never do it. They never elevate mankind. They never elevate the cause of the poor. They always claim to do so. They gather the movement. And the early church understood the fact that when the Antichrist rises, he will be a populist leader, okay? He will promise to level the playing field and elevate the poor of the earth. And it's important to take note that much of the earth is in fact poor. Beyond this, let's go to the next slide. Islam is awaiting a populist Messiah, okay? In my first book, as well as in my first book, Antichrist, Islam's Awaited Messiah, as well as God's War on Terror, Walid Shubat and I very much walk through the Islamic expectations regarding their primary Messiah figure known as Imam al-Mahdi. Okay? And this end-time Islamic character, Muslims believe, will in fact be a populist. Let's look at a few Islamic traditions to see the Islamic expectations regarding their primary Messiah figure. In the last days of the Islamic community, the Mahdi will appear. He will give away wealth profusely. Flocks will be in abundance, and the Muslim community will be large and honored. In another tradition, and again, these are sacred traditions, in those years, Muhammad speaking, of my community, they will enjoy a time of happiness such as have never experienced before. A man will stand and say, "Give to me, Mahdi," and he will say, "Take." Okay? So not only does the Bible say that the Antichrist will be a populist who will invade the richest provinces for their plunder, loot, and spoil in order that he can gather followers, in order that he can bribe and pay off and buy a following, but the early church also very clearly understood that the Antichrist himself would be a populist. And folks, the Islamic world today is yearning for and awaiting a populist Messiah. All trends are merging into one unifying point, okay? It all comes together. Let's look at the next slide. I'm sorry. In conclusion on that point, I just want to say that regarding Dr. Fruchtenbaum's point, that the Antichrist comes to destroy Jews, Gog comes for plunder, folks, no, they both do. They both do. And the reason is because they are one and the same. They are one and the same. Again, if you had looked at the greater wealth of passages, that would have been very clear. Now, argument number 3, Dr. Fruchtenbaum says, the Ezekiel invasion comes from the north, but the Armageddon invasion comes from the whole earth. Again, simply not true. Let's look at the verse in Ezekiel first, Ezekiel 38, verses 14 through 16, as well as chapter 39, 1 through 3. This is the verse that shows that Ezekiel will come, that Gog will come from the north. It says, in that day when my people Israel are living in safety, will you not take notice of it? Again, God is speaking to Gog. He says, you will come from your place in the far north, you and many nations with you, a mighty army. You will advance against my people Israel like a cloud that covers the land. I am against you, O Gog. I will bring you from the far north and send you against the mountains of Israel. So yes, Gog and his armies are described as coming from the north. But so isn't the Antichrist in numerous passages throughout the Old Testament. Let's look at the next slide. In Daniel 11, verses 40 and 41, again, this is nearly universal agreement. People will say, this is indeed the Antichrist. Scholars are in near universal agreement on that. This is the Antichrist. At the time of the end, the king of the south, that's Egypt, will engage the Antichrist in battle, and it calls him the king of the north. Here the Antichrist is called the king of the north, and what this is a reference to, because it's coming out of a discussion of the Greek generals after Alexander died. His empire was broken up, and it eventually went to 4 different generals. Okay? And in the north, you had the Seleucid Empire, and in the south, you had I'm not sure exactly how you say it, the Ptolemaic Empire. And in history, those two kingdoms clashed. Okay? Israel was sort of caught right in the middle. And that historical event became a type for the Antichrist, became a type for what will occur with the Antichrist in the last days. The Bible always uses historical circumstances and situations to prophesy through toward that ultimate omega event, that time in history when Christ returns. Here the Antichrist is referred to as the king of the north. In Joel 2:20, again, the armies of the Antichrist are described as the northern armies. The Lord promises his people Israel, I will drive the northern army far from you, pushing it into a parched and barren land, with its front columns going into the eastern sea and those in the rear into the western sea. Its stench will go up, its smell will rise. Again, nearly universal agreement. This is speaking about the Antichrist. It calls his army the northern army. Next slide. In Jeremiah 50, verse 9, we have a description of the armies of the Antichrist, that in the last days, not only will they come against the nation of Israel, they will also be the nation that destroys what's called the harlot Babylon. And we're going to discuss that a little bit toward the end. But it says in Revelation 17 that the woman, the harlot Babylon, is riding on a beast, and then the beast turns and devours her. The beast is the Antichrist empire. So here in Jeremiah 50, we have a prophecy regarding the destruction of the woman, this woman Babylon. And how does it refer to the Antichrist's armies? It says, I will stir up and bring against Babylon an alliance of great nations from where? The land of the north. They will take up their positions against her. From the north she will be captured. Their arrows will be like skilled warriors who do not return empty-handed. Look, an army is coming from the north. Folks, throughout the prophets, the armies of the Antichrist are described as the armies of the north. The Antichrist is the king of the north. It is no different in the book of Ezekiel than it is anywhere else. This effort to try to draw a distinction between the armies of Gog and the armies of Antichrist by focusing exclusively on Revelation 19 falls apart when you look at the greater wealth of passages throughout the Bible. Also in Zephaniah 2:13, he will stretch out his hand against the north and destroy Assyria, and he will make Nineveh a desolation and dry like a wilderness. Once again, referring to the end times, the Antichrist's armies from the north. Argument number 4. The Ezekiel invasion this is Fruchtenbaum speaking, is destroyed through the convulsions of nature. Okay? So the Ezekiel, that's the Gog invasion, he says that's destroyed through the convulsions of nature, whereas the Armageddon invasion is destroyed by the personal second coming of Jesus Christ. There is, because people largely focus on the book of Revelation, not the greater wealth of passages throughout the Bible that speak about the Antichrist, it is often believed that that Jesus will come forward out of heaven and sort of snap his fingers and boosh, the entire world will be, all of his enemies will be destroyed like a nuclear explosion, and it'll happen in a flash. The fact of the matter is, numerous passages describe him over, it may be a very, very brief period of time, but him walking out the vengeance of God, him, treading the winepress and executing vengeance and literally conquering and destroying and judging nations. It doesn't happen instantaneously. Let's look at the next slide. What I've done is put together a chart where I compare Ezekiel to Revelation. The fact of the matter is that if we simply do a comparison, the reality is that both Gog and the Antichrist both suffer a series of natural and supernatural judgments on them, and they are identical. In Ezekiel 38, we have it taking place in the land of Israel. Revelation 16, it speaks of a place called Armageddon, which of course is in Israel. In Ezekiel, he says, surely in that day there will be a great shaking. What does that mean? It's an earthquake. There will be a great shaking. Revelation 16, it says, and there was a great earthquake. A great shaking, a great earthquake. And then it elaborates, such as was not since men were upon the earth. This is an unparalleled earthquake. In Ezekiel, it sort of elaborates as well. It describes a mighty earthquake, so that the fishes, the fowls, the beasts, all the men that are upon the face of the earth shall shake at my presence. And that's a little hint. We're going to look at that some more. The Lord is present. Okay? This is not just shake at my power, shake at my might, shake at my presence. Over in Revelation, so mighty an earthquake, so great. Next slide. And the mountains shall be thrown down. That's Ezekiel. Over in Revelation, and the mountains were not found. Again, almost quoting verbatim. And the steep places shall fall, and every wall shall fall to the ground. That's Ezekiel in Revelation. And the cities of the nations fell, and every island fled away. Folks, if all the mountains and all the cities are destroyed in Ezekiel 38, and as many claim this takes place 7 years prior to this other earthquake, then how are all the mountains and cities falling again several years later? Does that make any sense at all? Let's look at the next slide. Not only do Gog and Antichrist both experience unparalleled, massive earthquakes, they both also experience unparalleled, massive hailstones. Okay? It's both describing the same thing. In Ezekiel 38, I will rain upon him, that's upon Gog, and upon his bands, and upon the many people that are with him, an overflowing rain and great hailstones, fire and brimstone. Over in Revelation, describing Armageddon, they gathered the kings together to the place in Hebrew that is called Armageddon, and there came from the sky huge hailstones, about 100 pounds each. Next slide. Not only do Gog and the Antichrist both experience unparalleled earthquakes, unparalleled hailstorms, they both also experience plagues. In Ezekiel, it says, I will execute judgment upon him, that's Gog, with plague and with bloodshed. Speaking of the Antichrist, in Zechariah 14, the Lord says, this is the plague with which the Lord will strike all the nations that fought against Jerusalem. Their flesh will rot while they are standing on their feet. Their eyes will rot in their sockets, and their tongues will rot in their mouths. Some people have speculated that may be some sort of a nuclear event. It seems to be speaking of the plague of the Lord, the power of the Lord. Who knows exactly what that's speaking of? Praise God, we won't have to experience it. Next slide. Okay, argument number 5. The Ezekiel invasion, Dr. Fruchtenbaum says, is destroyed on the mountains of Israel. The Armageddon campaign is destroyed in the area between Petra and Jerusalem. And I'll be honest with you, I'm almost slightly embarrassed to even have to address this one. But it's set forward as a valid, argument as for why Gog and Antichrist are two separate individuals. So the claim is the Gog invasion, they're destroyed on the mountains of Israel, whereas the Antichrist is destroyed at a specific place in Israel. The problem with this, folks, is that this phrase, the mountains of Israel, is an expression. In no way is this intended to say that the Gog armies will only die on the mountains. They won't die in the valleys, they won't die in the plains, they won't die in the foothills, they will only die on the mountains. This would be akin to saying, let's say that there was a massive invasion of America that was imminent, and the president said, you can go ahead and you can invade the United States. If you do so, let it be known that your armies will be laid out all across the fruited plains. And then the invader says, oh, well, I guess we'll just have to avoid the plains then, and we'll be fine. No, it's an expression. The mountains of Israel is an expression referring to Israel. In fact, just a few chapters earlier in Ezekiel 36, the Lord says to Ezekiel, he says, Son of man, prophesy to the mountains of Israel and say, to the mountains of Israel, to the hills, to the valleys, to the ravines, to the cities, da-da-da-da. It's simply an expression. It's not intended to be taken in a hyper-literal fashion. Okay? Let's go to the next argument. The Gog-Magog invasion takes place while Israel is living securely in the land. But the Armageddon takes place while Israel is in flight and in hiding. Okay, now once again, we need to take into consideration the fact that the Ezekiel passage is describing the general, it's a very general perspective on the coming of the Antichrist leading up to the time when he invades Israel. The Armageddon campaign is a specific, directed, zoomed-in perspective just on the final battle. Okay? The Ezekiel 38 is a very wide, sort of angled perspective. So the idea is that, folks, in the middle of the 3.5 years, okay, that's when the Antichrist begins his actual real fighting. That's when he's really invading. The beginning of the 7 years, that's when he initiates a false peace treaty. A false peace treaty with the Jewish people, right? He promises them peace and security, and they believe it, and they buy it, and they are living in the land feeling secure. But then in the middle of the 3.5 years, he violates that, he reneges on his promises, and that's when all hell breaks loose, which is at the middle of the 3.5 years, right? Let's go to the next slide. So Ezekiel 38, verses 12 and 13 speak of the fact that Gog will invade a peaceful and unsuspecting people, right? I will invade a land of unwalled villages. I will attack a peaceful and unsuspecting people, all of them living without walls, without gates, without bars. That's Gog. Well, folks, the Antichrist is described in identical fashion. Daniel 11:24. We already read this. When the richest provinces what? Feel secure. He will invade them. And then in Daniel 8:25, there's that famous verse, through peace, he, Antichrist, will destroy many. Folks, the biblical descriptions of the Antichrist and Gog are identical because they are the same individual. Any attempt to try to say that Ezekiel 38 and Armageddon are two different events fall down when we look at the broader range of passages. Now, there's one more argument that I didn't include here in the slides, and some of you may have heard it, but the argument says that Gog cannot be the Antichrist because it says that the Jewish people will burn their weapons for 7 years and bury their bodies for 7 years. And they say, therefore, it can't be the Antichrist. And I'll be honest with you, I don't even understand what that argument means, but I've heard it thrown around quite a bit. Oh, yeah, well, that couldn't be. And then that argument gets thrown out. It's almost a cliche that just gets passed around, but I don't understand the reasoning behind it. Folks, during the millennium, life goes on the earth. Life goes on. There is still very real domestic and agricultural events. You know, there is marriage and birth and so forth, okay? Of course, we'll be in glorified bodies, so that's not for us. But those people on the earth will still live a very earthly existence. In fact, this description of burning weapons is very, very similar to the descriptions of the millennium, which is described in Micah as well as Isaiah. And it says during that time, they will beat their swords into plowshares, right? They're converting military weapons into agricultural tools. Likewise, in Ezekiel, it says that they will take weapons and they will burn them. They're using them for fuel. There's no reason to say that they can't be burning weapons into the millennium. There is a period after Christ comes into power when he's literally rebuilding the earth. He's cleansing the earth. They're burying bodies. They're burning weapons. It's really the same picture, and I've never understood why that is somehow used, but it's thrown around a lot, and I wanted to address it. Now I want to turn away from the negative arguments, trying to disprove arguments. You know, the fact of the matter is that these arguments represent really the best of the best. And again, that is why I cited Dr. Fruchtenbaum, because among the different folks that have tried to make their lists, he really is the cream of the crop. He's the best. But in concluding, looking at his arguments, I could have not even dealt with his arguments. I could have just walked through each point that he made and just said, for instance, here's why Gog and the Antichrist are the same. They both come from the north. They both invade land for plunder, loot, and spoil. They both do this. They both do that. I could have just shown them all in the positive. The only reason I wanted to address his arguments is because they carry so much weight. And again, things, they develop feet of their own. They get passed around like a cliche, like, if I just cite these things, then I'm done with it, and I don't ever have to actually apply my mind to this and look up the Scriptures and be a Berean. Every one of them, when examined further, prove just the opposite. They end up proving just the opposite of that which he was attempting to establish, and on all points, Gog and the Antichrist are seen to be identical. Now again, let's look at some further proofs that Gog and the Antichrist are one and the same. Next slide. Reason number one is because of the numerous commonalities. Now again, as I just said, I could have utilized several of the verses that we've already looked at to establish this, but there's a lot more. There's a lot more commonalities between Ezekiel 38 and all of the various antichristic passages. Next slide. Both passages feature the feast of God, and this is interesting. Next slide. This is very interesting because, in fact, Revelation 19 quotes almost verbatim from Ezekiel 38. And you have to ask yourself the question, if these two events are supposedly so different, why in the world would God cite extensively from one event that is completely unrelated and apply it to something that is supposedly completely different? Okay? This is speaking about the feast of God. In Ezekiel 39, it says there's a call that goes out, a cry rings out. In Revelation 19, he says, I saw an angel standing in the sun who cried out. Okay, so both passages begin with the call, with the cry going out. Who is the call made to? In Ezekiel, it is to every kind of bird and all the wild animals. Revelation 19, it's made to all the birds flying in midair. In Ezekiel 39, the call is this: assemble, come together from all around. Revelation 19, come, gather together. Again, almost a direct quotation. Next slide. What is the call? Who is the Lord inviting the birds and the beasts to? In Ezekiel, it is to the sacrifice that I am preparing for you, the great sacrifice on the mountains of Israel. In Revelation, it's to the great supper of God. You see, folks, at the end of the age, we will experience the marriage supper of the Lamb, right? We're invited to a wedding feast. And what this passage is saying is either get yourself on the invitation list or plan on being a feast yourself, okay? You have an option. You can either be there at the marriage supper of the Lamb, Or you can be part of the feast, and the birds and the beasts will feast on you, and you will be the feast. Look what it says in Ezekiel 39. You will eat the flesh of mighty men and drink the blood of the princes of the earth at my table. You see, Ezekiel is speaking of the feast of God at my table. You will eat your fill of horses, riders, mighty men, soldiers of every kind, declares the Lord. Over in Revelation, the same thing, so that you may eat the flesh of kings, generals, mighty men, their horses, riders, the flesh of all people, free and slave, small and great. Guys, it is almost a direct quotation. It's a loose quotation. Next slide. Okay, beyond that, not only do both passages feature the feast of God, they both also have the commonality in that both Gog's armies and the Antichrist armies are seen to attack each other at the end. Next slide. Zechariah 14, verses 12 through 13. This is speaking about the Antichrist and his armies. On that day, men will be stricken by Yahweh with great panic. Each man will seize the hand of another, and they will attack each other. The Antichrist armies, they're gathered together in the land of Israel, and they start attacking each other. This is identical to that which we have seen over the past few years in Iraq. Brother against brother, Sunni versus Shia. Muslims are willing to lay down their differences for a period of time if it means invading Israel because of their hatred of Israel and Jews and so forth. But even in the midst of it, they are seen to be fighting each other. They turn their swords on each other. Likewise, in Ezekiel, an identical description is seen. I will summon a sword against Gog on all my mountains, declares the sovereign Lord. Every man's sword will be against his brother. Okay? Once again, Ezekiel and Gog and the Antichrist are seen to be identical. Next slide. Both coalitions consist of the same nations. See, this is interesting because what is taught, and again, I want to reiterate this fact, what is taught by many teachers today, some of you may have read Joel Rosenberg's books, Epicenter, okay? He's talking about the fact that Israel will soon see the Russian Islamic coalition invade the land of Israel, and they will be decimated. Okay? And this is believed by a large percentage of the church today. They will be utterly decimated. Israel will rule the greater Middle East. This is something that is taught that we should expect to see in the very near future, several years before the coming of Antichrist. Okay? But if that's the case, then the Gog coalition is said to involve Ethiopia and Libya. In Ezekiel 38, verse 5, it says, again, Cush and Libya with them, all of them with shield and helmet. And they're completely decimated, supposedly, right? Well, then why is it that several years later, under Antichrist, the very same nations are following the Antichrist? I thought they've already been decimated. Daniel 11:43, and the Libyans and the Ethiopians shall be at his heels, shall follow at his heels. Speaking of the Antichrist. In the few verses where the specific nations are mentioned, they are seen to be the same nations. It doesn't make sense. The claim that the Gog's armies are destroyed several years before the Antichrist, and these are two different armies, it doesn't make sense. They're both, if that's the case, then these nations have resurrected and come back a few years later. It doesn't make sense. Reason number 2 is that it contradicts the external evidence. And what I'm saying here is simply this. In the second session today, we looked at a handful of passages, and we looked at some more in the last session that show that the nations which Jesus is waging battle against, that he is fighting against when he returns, are all Middle Eastern nations. And therefore, if all of these Middle Eastern nations are going to be destroyed several years prior to the coming of Christ, then how in the world is Jesus seen to be fighting against them all several years later? Again, it doesn't make sense. If these nations are destroyed, then how is it that they all come back several years later? The fact that Jesus is seen to be judging and executing vengeance against Middle Eastern nations is proof that these nations will be around, will be fighting against Israel, will be invading Israel right up until the very end. There will be no massive decimation and irrelevant sizing, is that a word, of the Islamic world. Okay, there is no evidence in the Bible. Let's go to the next slide. This is huge, okay? This is huge. Christ is present. Christ is present. Ezekiel 38 portrays the parousia, okay? Steve talked a bit about the parousia last night. Throughout the New Testament, the return of Christ there's a few different words that is used to describe that, but the primary word is the parousia. That is the presence of Jesus. Here in Ezekiel 38, follow this. In my zeal and my fiery wrath, I declare that at that time there shall be a great earthquake in the land of Israel. The fish of the sea, the birds of the air, the beasts of the field, every creature that moves along the ground, and all the people on the face of the earth will tremble at what? My power? No. At my presence. Okay, guys? Jesus is present. This is not simply, his glory, his presence is manifest this is his actual face. Let's go to the next slide. The word there in Hebrew is panim. It means his face. It means to be right in front of his face. They will tremble, the Lord says, at my face. The word there means the actual presence. It is the Hebrew equivalent of the Greek parousia. It's the same word that is used back in Genesis, for instance, 32 verse 30, where Jacob called the name of the place. This is after Jacob had wrestled with God. He had wrestled with God all night, and he named the place Peniel, for I have seen God panim to panim. I have seen God face to face, and my life is preserved. The nations will tremble at the time of that massive earthquake described in Ezekiel 38. That is describing the return of Christ. Jesus will be present. Next slide. Adding to that fact is this one, Ezekiel 39 verse 7. And it says, and the heathen, that's the nations, the Gentile nations, shall know that I am Yahweh, the Holy One of Israel, the Holy One in Israel. Okay? Next slide. That phrase, the Holy One of Israel, is Kadosh Yisrael. It's used 32 times in Scripture. And now, I'm not a Hebrew scholar, okay? If you look through every translation that you can pull out, every one of those 32 references, the translation will be the Holy One of Israel, except in this passage. Except in this passage. And every translation that I have found will say the Holy One in Israel. Okay, guys? God himself is present. Ezekiel 38, the battle of Gog and Magog, is describing the return of Jesus. Reason number 4, building upon that fact. Ezekiel 38 and 39 describe the day of the Lord. The Lord basically comes right out and calls it. I mean, it almost couldn't be more clear. After the defeat of Gog and Magog, he says that he will no longer allow his name to be profaned. From that time forward, he will never allow his name to be profaned. That only speaks of one particular time in history. Follow this, Ezekiel 38, verses 23 through 39. Verses 23 through chapter 39, 7 through 8. And I'm skipping through here a little bit and whittling it down. I will make myself known in the sight of many nations. This is speaking of after the destruction of Gog and his armies. I will make myself known in the sight of many nations. Then they will know that I am Yahweh. He repeats that over and over. Then they will know that I am Yahweh. They will know that I am Yahweh. I will make known my holy name among my people Israel. I will no longer let my holy name be profaned. And the nations will know that I, Yahweh, am the Holy One in Israel. It is coming. It will surely take place, declares the Lord. Guys, this is the day that I have spoken of. He couldn't have spelled it out any more clear. This is not an event that takes place several years before the day that I'm always speaking of. This is the day. It couldn't be more clear. It's right in front of us. It's right in front of us. Next slide. So the house of Israel will know that I am the Lord from that day forward. Okay? Again, earlier I spoke of that time when Israel experiences a national salvation. They have a national coming to Jesus party. They look upon the one they have pierced as he breaks forward from the sky. They see that Yeshua is in fact their deliverer as he delivers them from the captivity among the nations and brings them back to the land. From that day forward, they know that Yahweh is their God. They know that Yeshua is the Holy One in Israel. This is spoken of in Matthew 23:39, where Jesus said, I say unto you, you shall not see me henceforth till ye say, blessed is he who cometh in the name of the Lord. That's speaking about the return of Christ. Folks, everything about the events and the language of this passage points us to the culmination of the final events of the last days. This is not speaking about some mere opening act that takes place several years before all of the big events. This is the magnificent capstone of the last days, okay? This passage is speaking about the same thing that all the prophets are speaking about. And this is the one where God comes right out and basically just says, Gog, you're Antichrist. I mean, he basically says that. I said at the beginning, and I said to remember the fact that all of the prophets are telling the same story. When we look throughout all the prophets, when we look throughout the Psalms, and even largely throughout the Torah, all of the prophets are telling the same story. At the end of the age, a coalition of nations invades the land of Israel. They kill a significant percentage of the people, the inhabitants of Israel. They take many of them captive. This is the time of Jacob's trouble, the final hour of the chastisement against his people. Then the Lord himself comes and directly intervenes and delivers his people. It's the same story. The Jewish people, who again are thoroughly Old Testament literate, as opposed to, unfortunately, a significant percentage of the church today, would understand this fact. And then God says this, and anybody who is thoroughly Old Testament literate would have understood this statement clearly. God says this is what Yahweh the sovereign says. Are you, speaking of Gog, not the one that I've spoken of in the former days by my servants, the prophets of Israel? At that time, they prophesied for many years that I would bring you against them. In other words, God comes right out and he says, look, you're the same one that they're all talking about. All the prophets have been talking about the Antichrist. They're all talking about the same story, and you are the same one. It's a rhetorical question, and the answer is yes, you are the same one. God comes right out and says, Gog, you are the Antichrist. You're the same guy that all the prophets are talking about. If in fact, Gog is not the Antichrist, but is, as it is commonly taught, a Russian-led coalition, then show me one verse anywhere else in the Bible where it speaks about a Russian coalition, and there is none. There is not a single verse anywhere in the Bible where any of the prophets are speaking about some Russian coalition. It does not exist. And yet that portion of this passage is ignored by those that would claim that Gog is anyone other than the Antichrist. Conclusion, all the prophets speak of the same event. I think I've made this point pretty clear. It's all talking about the same thing. Let me just highlight something real briefly here at the end in conclusion. Why is this so important? Why am I spending so much time focusing on this? What is happening in the church today, unfortunately, and again, this is just human nature, and this is not to berate anybody, folks. I spend an inordinate amount of time in biblical prophecy, and very few people have the ability to do that, nor the emotional energy to do that. Okay, I've been parked here for years, and it is extremely draining, but it's an important subject for right now. So most people tend to be very good students of their teachers, okay? But few people are really good students of history and scripture. Very few of us have enough time, We don't have time to, exercise or pray or study the way that we'd like to. It's just the nature of, it's the American way. But we do have time to occasionally read a book and so forth. And most of the larger prophecy teachers today are teaching that in the very near future, Israel is going to be invaded by a massive Middle Eastern coalition of nations, and they usually teach Russia as well, and that those nations will be decimated. Israel, the IDF, will conquer all those nations, and Israel will expand throughout the Middle East. Now, how many people in the room here became a believer or were influenced by someone who became a believer during the Jesus movement of the 70s? There's a handful. There's a handful. During the 70s, the Jesus movement was a genuine revival, and it dramatically impacted this nation, and it spread, okay? One of the primary driving factors of that revival was the fact that during that time and during that time immediately preceding that, the nation of Israel was fulfilling biblical prophecy before the eyes of the world. Okay, during the War of Independence in 67, during the Six-Day War in 73, Israel, I got them 48 and 67, and then again, a great victory in 73. The nation of Israel was established as a nation and then took Jerusalem, okay? They were fulfilling biblical prophecy before our eyes. There is power in prophecy, okay? The fulfillment of biblical prophecy is a powerful apologetic for the validity of this book, okay? It's something that no other book can claim. The reestablishment of the nation of Israel in their land proves that this book is from God. The Quran cannot claim that. No other book can claim accurate, fulfilled biblical prophecy, not even nearly of that caliber. You know, they got to really try to squeeze things to make it look prophetic. Since that time, the church has continued to harbor and maintain a certain measure of what I'll call Israeli triumphalism. It's hard for the church to believe that the time will ever come when the nation of Israel will be conquered and nearly destroyed, okay? And we don't like to believe the fact that God would allow that to take place to His people. Much of the church today is waiting to be raptured. You know, we're just going to be delivered from the hard times, and then, Israel kind of gets chastised. But only thing we're going to see, as it's taught, is that Israel's going to defeat the entire Muslim world. The whole Muslim world is going to be rendered irrelevant. And then the Antichrist comes out of Europe and so forth, you know. As I said, Oprah's going to send out the email, and overnight there'll be a new religion that's just going to be birthed, and everyone's going to sign up, and it's just going to happen overnight. You know, that's essentially what's taught, minus the Oprah, but you get the idea. Again, there is power in prophecy. If, in fact, the majority of the evangelical church today, if a large segment of the evangelical church, that portion that is paying attention to prophecy and believing this notion that Israel will soon destroy her enemies, if they are believing a fantasy that is not rooted in the Bible, but in fact, the day is coming soon, you know, maybe within the next several years, that many of us will literally see the nation of Israel conquered and destroyed, folks. Even as during the Jesus movement, the fulfillment of biblical prophecy was a powerful apologetic, leading people to become Christians, leading people to convert, so also, in my opinion, will the destruction of the nation of Israel be a powerful anti-apologetic, which will lead to the disillusionment of large segments of the church. They're going to go, wait a minute, the Bible doesn't say that Israel would ever get destroyed, or if it did, we're supposed to be gone. We're not supposed to see it. Something's wrong. Something's wrong. And folks, I really believe that a combination of a false belief regarding the rapture and a false adherence to this Israeli triumphalism is setting up a significant measure of the church, a significant percentage of the church for great disillusionment, and the potential there for people to fall and to experience shipwreck of faith is enormous and legitimate, okay? The thing that always gets me is that prophecy conferences are usually pretty well attended, and so much of the church comes, and it's always struck me as odd because the majority of those that attend these conferences are from the pre-trib position. And so it strikes me that the church, it's almost as if, are we that bored with, the weekly sermons about finances and relationships that we need to go to these conferences and talk for hours about things that most of the people don't even believe they'll ever see? It's almost sort of this strange fixation on trivia, or even to a degree almost like science fiction. We're never going to see it, but we spend hours studying it. But folks, I believe that Steve established a very solid biblical case for the post-tribulational rapture, the notion that we will, in fact, as the church, go through these events. And if that's the case, if these are things that we're going to live through and experience, then the specifics and the details, such as if Gog is the Antichrist or not, carry on a deep significance, folks, from a pastoral perspective. These things matter. And I believe that many of us in this room will see the unfolding of these events, because the fact of the matter is that, as we'll see in next session, these things are coming into play. They're developing rapidly right before us. They are happening now. And from a pastoral perspective, folks, we need to understand what the Bible says, and that way we can help give understanding to those that are in confusion and so forth, and that are experiencing disillusionment. The potential there for great damage to come to the church as a result of false teaching is huge. Okay? That's why it matters. That's why it matters.